Good day, folks. Thanks for coming to Finding the Warmth of Our Sun. I'm Matthew Browngan, your host here at Madison365. You can find us on YouTube, Spotify, Stitcher, and Apple Podcasts. Please hit subscribe, share, and all that jazz. Unfortunately, this week is going to be a rebroadcast of Obama and coming to terms with the failure of Democrats. I think this is timely right now, particularly in light of, well, how Democrats haven't passed any voter protection laws and basically given up on it, among a few other things that are going on right now, such as the failure to extend the moratorium on evictions, partly because of congressional vacations. It's a mess, folks. And but anyways, I hope you enjoy this episode. I should be back next week. Unfortunately, I had to tend to my health for this week. But I hope you all have a good one. Mask up and stay safe out there from this Delta variant. Thanks, folks. All right. Good day, folks. Good day. Hope you're doing all right out there. I'm Matthew Brown here at Finding the Warmth of Our Sun here at Madison365. You can hit us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and YouTube. Yeah. So today, or really this week, I guess, I'm covering a topic that is going to be hard for folks. A lot of folks. It's really using somebody as a specific or micro example of a larger problem for many Democrats, both in power as well as voters, really. And I'm really kind of speaking as far as voters in an existence of cognitive dissonance, of liking people or embracing something a certain way, right, because they like them. And I'm using Obama as this example. It's an acceptance of the historical, not necessarily present, but historical U.S. status quo within modern history. I'm talking really post-civil rights movement. One that doesn't lend a fully critical eye towards the role elected Democrats have played in the breaking and downfall of our nation, and the role in corruption, in the forever war, in economics, in race, where people can, and these voters can, on one hand, say, Black Lives Matter, these things, like this, that, and the third. I don't support the war on terror, tax the rich down the line. But then continue to embrace political entities that effectively perpetuated those things or helped perpetuate those things, like Obama. So we know, the GOP live in an almost fully alternate reality, denying science, facts of U.S. history, past and present. But this is not to say that people on the left, and I'm talking more so broadly within Democratic, a large chunk of Democratic voters, don't fall privy to cognitive dissonance within their own worldview and the people they support that perpetuate a worldview they might not necessarily agree with in their hearts, but they like these people. This is, and some of it's even like a West Wing-ification and vision of politics with the United States. This, and I should say this more falls upon the leaders, and Obama fell within this, of high-minded ideals and rhetoric that don't necessarily translate to policy outside of small, claimingly pragmatic, intermediate or small steps forward for progress. It is also one that fails to confront the truths of the American imperial and colonial history and legacy of our empire. And it's very much an empire. We live, even on in of itself, on colonized land through genocide. It's one that has an inability to fully grasp the role people we like played in this President Carter is another one of these individuals where a lot of people love him and have a very kind eye towards him, almost a softness of his presidency that, if only, maybe things would have been different. If only he beat Reagan, right? But that also ignores the role he played in, there are other aspects within his domestic policy, but focusing right now on his foreign policy and setting up the Carter Doctrine, which is one of the core basis for our modern day foreign policies within the Middle East. It basically put their procurement and securing of oil front and center within our national foreign policy, and a philosophy that basically said the U.S. was within its rights to use military force anywhere in the world to secure oil supplies. Again, not the sole trigger, as other acts of foreign intervention, particularly centered around the Cold War, fed into parts of this, such as the installment of the Shah in Iran, which the anti-democratic Shah in Iran, which then kicked off a long cause and effect, which brought us our present-day Iranian government. So it wasn't the sole thing, but it is a very real major trigger to our modern-day Middle East policies. And these folks helped drive us towards the iceberg. And Obama is part of this. And the inability for Democratic voters to fully see his role for various different reasons. They like him, GOP obstruction, he's not, kinder, gentler emperor, right? There's a real cognitive dissonance there. There's an excuse of, is kind of a strange intersection of excuses. One is, you don't understand what the presidency is. It's the presidency. Well, okay, a presidency that is one that upholds an unjust order. Why should I support a presidency, thus, or at least particularly uncritically support such a presidency? Now, I might vote for somebody based upon a philosophy of minimizing harm or harm reduction. But that doesn't necessarily mean that, one, you can't be critical, and two, harm reduction also doesn't mean that political entity doesn't perpetuate harm. And I'm not trying to talk in some weird utopian sense, because there's a very real world where we can have a presidency that doesn't have core aspects of it being war crimes. We don't have to have forever wars. We don't have to drone citizens. So obstructionism is real, but that also doesn't mean that there weren't real moments in Obama's presidency or elsewhere else time where he failed or Democrats failed to wield power. And it particularly where they failed to wield power was in a way that they kept reacting in such a way of being scared of what the GOP is going to do. They played scared. They played fear. They played scared of their opponent's reaction, not on wielding power. And wielding power in such a way that makes people grateful that they wielded power, and in such a way that entrenches their power. Now, there's real ways to wield power in a democratic way that helps entrench your power in a democratic way. These things, again, aren't mutually exclusive, such as presently if Biden got rid of, not Biden, but let's say they took the Senate and in coordination with each other did filibuster reform, got rid of the filibuster, expanded the courts, passed a voting rights law, and brought in D.C. and Puerto Rico for statehood. These things are an expansion of democratic rights, like kind of the small d, the expansion of democracy. But because of the political landscape of the United States, helps Democrats build power in real ways. But there's more to just wielding power. Let's actually think of this as with an analogy. Let's say the Packers lost a game by 3 points against a very good team. I would say Seahawks, but their defense is kind of trash right now. But let's say, a pass game when you had the Legion of Boom and they had a good QB, great QB and Russell Wilson, and they lost. I could have gone back and looked at a real game, but this is a hypothetical situation. So let's say they lost by 3 points. Seahawks played great. You could say, well, they played and lost to a better team. That's which wouldn't necessarily be wrong either. But sometimes there's also context within that game. Let's say there were key moments where there was a offensive hold that didn't need to happen on or a false start that happened on a 4th and short near the end of the game that forced it into a 4th and long, and they couldn't convert. And they had to make that. Or there was a drop pass on a 3rd and long in a key situation that would have gotten them first down, put them in scoring position, or even a drop touchdown that made it so that they had to kick a field goal or kick the field goal instead of going. These decisions or mistakes you make that didn't have anything to do with the quality of your opponent or what your opponent is doing, but fall upon you and your failed execution that also cost the game. So while Seattle might have done great things, maybe they did less mistakes, right? And it didn't cost them the game. The Packers were in a situation, in this hypothetical, where they could have won the game if they didn't make the mistakes that they made. And looking back on history, it's definitely always hard with hypotheticals, but think of it kind of like that. It's not a fully, one-to-one analogy, but it's kind of like that, where yes, the GOP played massive obstruction politics, but the Dems and Obama played scared and made mistakes in such a way that they perhaps cost themselves, a lot, potentially a lot, particularly as we work through this. And again, I'm using this and working through this in such a way as a microcosm in how we can better evaluate history in the United States and the myths and lies of the United States, and really seeing something for what it is to better inform ourselves how to move forward. And I'm just some lowly cat here in Madison, so it's not like I have a big impact on what Biden chooses to do or what Dem leadership chooses to do. But we as voters, have more of a say in this than we think in a lot of ways. Part of it is just the narrative that we choose to accept. And if we reject a certain part of the narrative, or even accept a real part of the narrative, then things kind of change. How we perceive and accept these certain things definitely, I believe, can change how our political actors will act. One of the core parts of this is the criticism of the left flank in a way that aids the GOP. A Dr. Donna Austin tweeted, folks out here expecting way more energy or expending way more energy arguing about why defund the police is a bad slogan than they ever did trying to stop police from killing black folk. And that's true. And there's more to that, and got into the defund argument in a past cast. If you want to learn more about defund, learn about that there. But there's a real failure to, not saying don't be, if you want to be critical, but part of the reason, Black Lives Matter, a lot of people had to explain that to other folks. Instead of being like, oh, it's a bad slogan, you start explaining, you create message discipline. And maybe you don't necessarily have to, as an elected leader, embrace defund as a slogan, because one is an activist slogan, not an electoral slogan, but defund has actually, one, been effective. Seattle is cutting 15% from its police budget, and more cities across the nation are starting to embrace funding mental health first response unit. That is effectiveness of a slogan. So you can't say it's not effective, particularly when police funding is mostly a local issue. But let's say you're running for Congress. People don't support necessarily the defund slogan, but they support the policies that fall under defund far more, than they are against it. So run on those policies, act and support those policies. Don't run on the slogan. But again, elected leaders aren't activists, and it's an activist slogan, and activists play a very real way in this. And Obama and other folks have criticized activists in such a way that said you're not playing the game right, you're doing this, that, and the third wrong, without recognizing the very real way that activists are instrumental in their effectiveness in governing. They want and need activists to get elected, but then tell them to be quiet once they're elected, and don't want them to push them once they're elected, but yet need them and their organizations to be elected. You can't have it both ways. Again, that doesn't necessarily mean you have to fully embrace activists and all the demands of what they want, but you don't have to actively combat them, particularly in public and particularly in a way that aids the GOP and the GOP framing and narrative. And, but his activist stuff has been long running. He's had a long history of particularly of demeaning Black Americans and effectively, aiding in that pull yourself up by the bootstrap mentality, that nothing is fundamentally wrong with America as long as you work hard, dig deep, and get a good education, all that stuff down the line. He's into BS respectability politics that denies the strength and severity of institutional, systemic, and systematic racism within this country, and puts it as a negative infraction that's just upon individual negativity of just these small individuals doing racist acts, and doesn't see the enormity of it, and says that you as a Black person, if you acted a certain way, they look at you a certain way, and Obama's presidency completely diminishes all of that, yet he still kind of embraces this mentality. And again, Obama, not to come, but he is a microcosm of this larger problem that we see within Democrats. Also as a failure to wield power when they have it, and particularly a mandate, which he had in 2008, where they had 59 Senate seats, failed to enact filibuster reform because of fear of what the GOP would do, and they had to negotiate with themselves with a few handful around Emanuel's Blue Dog Democrats that he helped get elected that were practically Republicans, and they couldn't get to vote along with them without appeasing them. So they couldn't do what they really needed to do, which created a large domino effect. One of those domino effects was, let's say, the Paris Accords, which was far smaller than it should have been. And in fact, many world leaders were willing to follow along the United States, really with a massive investment. But part of the problem, part of why Obama negotiated down, was because he knew the Senate wouldn't pass a treaty. So you had to have something that fell within presidential action and so on and so forth. But part of the beginning of the problem of this came in 2008, 2009, when they failed to pass cap and trade law again with the 59 seats, had to negotiate, couldn't do this. Well, again, if you had filibuster reform, you could have done this and launched on a larger road. If you had filibuster reform, the stimulus wouldn't have been as small. It needed to be about $3 trillion. It was about $800 billion. Now, the stimulus worked-ish. Even though wages stagnated, it worked-ish. Even though it didn't change the ability and livelihood of real people. Most of the jobs that were created out of it were lower wage jobs, and it worked-ish. A large chunk of it, Krugman called about $600 billion of it actually full-on stimulus, with half of that tax cuts. And a lot of the state and local aid was taken out in negotiations, and these things would have been the most impactful. Okay, so then you fell at cap and trade, fell at filibuster reform because of cap and trade. You had a small stimulus. Oh, wait, and they didn't break up the banks. No real consequences. Okay, this is all pre-2010, mind you. Pre-negotiated the ACA, making it smaller than it needed to be. And not just that, after it passed, let the GOP control the narrative, calling it Obamacare. ACA was hugely popular. Obamacare was not. The same thing. And many congressional reps failed to fully or rejected the embracing of ACA and took up the framing of the GOP with calling it Obamacare. ACA popular, but they did decide not to run on ACA. And they pre-negotiated it down before it even hit the floor to get it passed. And it could have been far stronger if they did filibuster reform, making more people would have liked it. More like there's still people that lost their health insurance because of the ACA. More people would have been able to be on it, particularly if you had single pay. Again, down the line, it was far weaker than it should have been, than it needed to be if they effectively wielded power. Another way they failed to effectively wield power is Rahm Emanuel, and under his direction, did not prioritize judicial appointments. He made it clear from a political article, did Obama win the judicial wars? Obama's first chief of staff, Rahm Emanuel, made it clear internally that he did not want to waste precious political capital on polarizing judges while trying to pass a stimulus bill, Obamacare, and new Wall Street rules. Again, these Wall Street rules were tepid at best. He also kept the Department of Homeland Security intact, same with ICE, and set up the infrastructure Trump went on to use for family separation. They built the cages and infrastructure Trump is using right now. Yes, there's an influx of immigrants, but there are better ways to handle that. And particularly within the first 2 years, a chance to pass comprehensive immigration reform, which they failed to do because they failed to effectively wield power. He was dubbed the deporter-in-chief because he deported more people than George Herbert Walker Bush. He also failed talking about Herbert Walker Bush, anybody accountable from the administration, legally accountable for torture and launching illegal wars. That entire administration should have been brought in front of the global war court and charged for war crimes and launching illegal wars and committing crime, and committing war crimes. But instead of doing that, Obama wanted to move forward and embrace the apparatus that George Bush set up. Expanding the war on terror, expanding the drone war, launching coups in Libya and elsewhere, expanding the drone war in Africa, destabilizing nations, killing civilians, and committing war crimes itself, because in his newest memoir, he states, and Rahm Emanuel pushed fear of being a weak liberal president on foreign policy, fear of the GOP. He was a commander-in-chief of the military, making military decisions based upon his chief of staff's fear to look weak to the GOP, fear of the GOP. And the biggest, one of the biggest failures, so you have this, he took the 50-state organizing apparatus, Obama for America, in 2008, and it fell silent for a couple of months after the election, losing massive amount of momentum, and folded it within the DOC and created Obama for America in 2008 and created Organizing for America, which is effectively an offshoot of the DNC. This was a Rolling Stones article covering this. Steve Hillenbrand, Obama's deputy campaign manager, tried to dissuade Poloff. The DNC is a political entity, he says. Senators who are going to need to put significant pressure on to deliver change. And goes on, basically push Plouffe to make Obama 2.0, independent nonprofit similar to Freedom Works and American for Prosperity, the right-wing instigators of the Tea Party. Free from the party apparatus, he argued, the group could raise unlimited funds and put enough pressure on conservative Democrats to keep them in line. But Poloff was resolute. Obama was troubled by the prospect of big-dollar donors driving an independent nonprofit, and the DOC offered a ready infrastructure and fewer legal hurdles. The president is a Democrat, says Stewart, a veteran of Obama's victory in Iowa, who took over as office director. It would be very hard to explain why Obama's grassroots field team is not housed within the party. So and so the New Republic also has a great telling of this in what they call Obama's Lost Army. So you add these first 2-year failures together. The failure of filibuster reform, meaning less impactful and immediate legislation that could have changed lives, with a broken organizing infrastructure that helped catapult, these things like, stronger stimulus, more people to work, better jobs, higher paying, more impactful lives, faster recovery, massive jobs programs. Right? Filibuster reform, you could have passed all of that. Better ACA, impacting people's lives, not worrying about any of that or being moved off healthcare, basically undercutting all the G-Polls argument. Better and all of that stuff down the line, breaking up the banks, which would have invigorated the folks, particularly that were within Occupy. And if you didn't take apart the organizing structure, these things combined easily could have made it up to the 2010 midterm losses that they had. Easily could have prevented those or minimized those to where they could have kept a majority in the Senate and the majority in the House. Easily could have done that. I don't want to say like easily. I'm guessing they would have lost some Senate seats, but you still could have had the majority in the Senate, House, and that changes the entire infrastructure, particularly in down ballot stuff. If you had independent OFA, because the biggest thing in 2010 was redistricting. And the GOP took over states and state houses, redistricted, wielded power effectively in their redistricting, and set themselves where they are now in such a way where they control so many states and so many different things. You had an organized infrastructure that countered the Tea Party and that uprising. You had mass mobilization. You failed to wield power when you had it for a variety of different reasons. Shrink small in the face of conflict. They shrank in the face of these choices and chose the tepid path instead of bold choices. He ran a bold campaign, regardless that he wasn't as progressive as some folks believed him to be or even he led on to be. He was still ran to the left of Clinton and still would have been the most progressive president that we had since, LBJ. Even if he, is effectively center left. And that just one partly shows how far things, as far as where the center has moved, things are weird, within the Democratic Party. Some other things he failed to do that set up the stage, particularly for Trump and this larger apparatus, is he continued to sign the extension of the 9/11 or 2001 War Powers Authorization Act. They got rid of the 2002 one, but this one effectively still gives presidents large amount of ability to conduct global military authorizations without congressional approval. He also assassinated a U.S. citizen that joined ISIS, but was still a U.S. citizen, using these 9/11 laws, but also these same laws also make it easier for the Department of Justice and others to label organizations of American citizens terrorists, and they've tried to do that with Black Lives Matter protesters. His DOJ didn't prosecute anyone under the Chicago PD Homeland Square black torture site. Okay, you want to talk about even some really wild stuff. He did some really messed up stuff with Ferguson and Flint. He sent the National Guard in to aid the Ferguson PD and other local PDs, which are immensely racist, and strictly condemned the Ferguson uprising, which was quite justified in very real ways. Instead of finding ways to aid and find real solutions to it, doubled down on the assistance of the implementation of police state and police militarization. We launched the 21st century Presidential Task Force on Policing, which is largely BS. As somebody that's worked on police reform over the last 5 years, let me tell you, these policies are middle of the road and tepid reforms. Most have been tried in a lot of different PDs with low to minimal effect in actually their intentions, particularly when it comes to racial disparities and police brutality and holding police accountable. These things have been tried. They've been talked about forever, and it's just kind of a new piece of work as something that's been talked about for a long time. Again, tepid reforms that didn't do much, and a tepidness to wield power and to confront institutional, issues. And we see some of these, and this directly ties back to last week's podcast of Madison and Madison progressives failing to wield power to create change within their own scope of power for reasons, for cognitive dissonance reasons, for other reasons, just failing to take the action they need to be. Obama's failures are a microcosm of the larger failures of most of the Democratic machine and apparatus and party members from the local level on up. He's not unique. It's a great example. And there are real lessons learned here. The GOP isn't scared to wield power. Democrats need to wield power when and where they can. And you can do it, and wielding power does not mean you are being undemocratic either. You can wield democratic power in real ways that improve people's lives and help solidify democracy in this country. And these are things that are hard to wrestle with. I get it, folks like Obama. Yes, the GOP had massive amounts of obstruction, but in things that he controlled, at crossroad after crossroad, he chose the tepid and fearful path and failed to wield power in the spheres of influences that he actually had. And I do want to put a little asterisk there. Presidents have a lot less power than a lot of people actually think they do, but they still have they absolutely have capability to wield power and have influence. And you see that in Trump. And some of this was also indicative of Democratic leadership that he was part of, in a failure of filibuster reform and a willingness to accept the conservatives within the rank and not battle them, and instead to negotiate with them, while also targeting and attacking their left flank. And let me tell you something, though. I know that some of y'all might make sense, but you're never going to be able to out-GOP the GOP. You're just not. So you might as well embrace the base that you got and empower them. Anyways, that's it for this week's On Finding the Warmth of Our Sun. I'm Matthew Brungman, your host here at Madison 365. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, and YouTube. Please hit subscribe, share with your friends, this, that, and the third. Do all that. Thanks for coming out. Please stay safe, wear your masks, even though vaccines are kind of around the corner. And you should probably cancel your Christmas plans if you have some, again. But thanks for joining us, and have yourselves a great week. Thank you.
This is 365 Media.